All right. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session, and thank you to Aaron and the employee education team for getting everything set up. So I am Matt Bigelow. I'm an associate ethics counselor in the recently consolidated DOI Departmental Ethics Office, but rest assured we're still servicing the National Park Service primarily. So again, today we're going to talk a little bit about the Hatch Act. I'm sure many of you have a basic awareness that the Hatch Act exists. I'm sure you've heard of the Hatch Act. I'm sure you've probably received kind of reminders every couple of years about the Hatch Act. We often touch on it in our ethics trainings or we mention it in certain advice we give to questions you ask. But today I'd like to go a little bit beyond that surface level and into a little more depth into this law and how it applies to us as executive branch employees. So my intent here is to provide you kind of with a firm foundation and understanding so that you can build on that as you continue your federal career. And the hope is that every couple of years when you get those reminders about the Hatch Act, either through email or if you get one of our trainings and we kind of touch on that surface level of Hatch Act, you'll have a little more context and understanding about what we're talking about. So throughout today's session, we will provide you with a background and overview of the Hatch Act through an explanation of kind of the core components of those restricted activities that apply to us. And we'll cover some key terms and phrases that are important to understand when thinking about and talking about the Hatch Act. We'll specifically talk about some of the particular things that are permitted and prohibited activities for employees. We'll also talk a little bit about the Hatch Act implications in the context of technology, such as social media and email. And also at the end, I'll touch on the Hatch Act implications of political activities that take place on outdoor NPS parkland. So I think we're scheduled for about an hour and a half. I think certainly the core content of this presentation will not take that long. So we should have plenty of time to address specific questions or scenarios you might have, and we'll open it up for that at the end. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So what exactly is the Hatch Act? It's a federal law that was passed way back in 1939 that limits certain political activities of federal employees. The core purposes then and now of that law were to ensure that government is administered in a way that is not influenced by partisan politics. Make sure that it's administered in a nonpartisan fashion. It also serves to protect employees from political coercion in the workplace, either from supervisors or those above them. And it also ensures that federal employees are advanced on merit, not based on their political affiliations outside of work or in their personal time. I'll let you be the judge of this, but the law does attempt to balance the right that we have as U.S. citizens to express our own personal beliefs and opinions with the need to maintain a federal workplace that is free of the coercive use of partisan politics. So that's kind of what the purpose of the Hatch Act is and a little bit of background about how it came about. Who exactly is covered by the Hatch Act? Essentially, every civilian executive branch employee is covered to some certain extent, of course, with the exception of the president and vice president. Within the Hatch Act, though, there are two categories of employees. There are less restricted employees, and there are further restricted employees. The less restricted employees are able to do a lot more than further restricted employees on their own time outside of work. In a sense, they can actively participate in partisan political activities to a certain extent, subject to the prohibitions that we'll talk about. The further restricted employees have additional restrictions that apply to them outside of work and on their own time. And so this class of employees are specifically outlined in the law and come from specific agencies or have specific positions. So over on the left-hand side, I've listed out all the specific agencies that are covered by these further restrictive further restricted categories. None of them really apply to the National Park Service. In the Park Service, there are a few people that are subject to these further restricted rules, primarily that involves career senior executive service employees. By and large, the vast majority of National Park Service employees are in that less restricted category. If, however, you are a career senior executive service employee, or maybe you fit one of those other categories underneath there, certainly reach out to the Ethics Office for additional guidance on the Hatch Act if you have not already received a briefing on the Hatch Act. This presentation is primarily going to cover those restrictions that apply to less restricted employees. And keep in mind that those less restricted employees' rules are subject, the further restricted employees are subject to those less restricted rules as well. So what exactly does the Hatch Act prohibit? There are two main categories of prohibited activities that are covered by the Hatch Act. The big ones are the 24/7 at all times restrictions. These are applicable whether you're on duty or off duty, in uniform or out of uniform, on federal property or off federal property. They restrict our activities regardless of the circumstance at all times. The second category of restrictions only apply when we're on duty or in the federal workplace wearing a uniform or anything that kind of connects us directly to our position with the Park Service. Let's talk a little bit in depth about those big four. What are the big four restrictions that apply to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of whether you're at home or on duty? Under the Hatch Act, employees may not use their official authority or influence to affect the outcome of an election. Number two, we cannot solicit, accept, or receive a political contribution. Number three, we cannot be candidates in partisan political elections. And number four, we cannot solicit, discourage the political activity of a person with, who has business before our employing office. Okay, so those are the four big core ones that regardless of whether you're on duty or off, we got to keep these in mind and make sure that we don't engage in any of those activities. So let's get into a little bit more detail about each of these. So what does it mean to use official authority in connection to influence or affect the outcome of an election? Some examples might be that you cannot use your official title or position while you're engaged in personal political activities, such as making a partisan speech or attending a rally or campaign event. You're free to do those things in your own time if you're a less restricted employee, but what you can't do is use your title or position in connection with those activities. We also cannot invite subordinate employees to political events or otherwise suggest that they attend political events or engage in any partisan political activity, right? So because the supervisor-subordinate relationship is inherently coercive, suggesting that your subordinate attend a political rally or support a political party or candidate is not appropriate and is conducive, coercive, and cannot be done at any time. Cannot use agency resources in connection with partisan political activities. So this includes official use of social media. It includes using your work computer or doing political work while on duty. All of those things are not permissible to do under the Hatch Act. And of course, you cannot use non-public information for any partisan political purposes. Again, that's using your official authority to influence the outcome of an election. The second big one that we can't do at all times is we can't engage in political fundraising. So regardless of whether you're on duty, regardless of whether or not you're using your personal resources or your own time, you cannot solicit, accept, or receive any political contributions. So some examples of this is you cannot ask for donations in person, by mail, by email, or social media, right? So if you are supporting a particular candidate or a particular party, that's all well and fine. But what you can't do is engage in a fundraising effort. You can't go door to door and ask for solicitations of money to support that candidate. You can't send chain mail or regular mail asking for any kind of donations or support, financial support. You cannot work a phone bank if part of that duty is asking for those political contributions. You can't host a political fundraiser. Certainly you could attend one in your personal capacity, but what you can't do is make that ask. You can't be kind of organizing and primarily being the one that is hosting the fundraising event. You cannot invite others to sell tickets to a political fundraiser either. So if, again, if you're supporting a campaign or a candidate, you can't offer up tickets to attend the fundraiser to your neighbors or your friends or anything like that. That would be considered a prohibited fundraising activity. And you cannot use any email account or social media to distribute, send, or forward content that solicits political contributions. Again, you got to be very careful about this. If you are politically active and you get that chain mail that comes into your inbox, that's all well and fine. You can certainly personally make a contribution, but if you were to forward that or send that to your contact and circulate that, that would be considered soliciting or accepting or receiving political contributions and cannot be done under the Hatch Act. So the third 24/7 restriction that applies to us in relation to the Hatch Act, so we cannot be candidates for public office in a partisan election. This is a fairly complicated one, but by and large, we cannot, we recommend that regardless of whether or not the particular office that you might be interested in running for is labeled as a partisan or nonpartisan election, definitely reach out to us for guidance. Even a nonpartisan election can become partisan if the employee or even an opponent introduces partisan politics into the campaign. We had an example not too long ago of an employee actually running for a school board position, right? So that within the community, the municipality where this individual was running, the position was nonpartisan in the sense that within the law it said that the candidates and the people holding positions did not have to affiliate with a political party. However, in this particular community, there was kind of a controversial issue that had taken place within the kind of weeks and months leading up to this particular election. And so even this generally nonpartisan office had become politically charged in that community. Their candidates were getting backed by political parties, and we're talking about their affiliation with those political parties. And so even though that office generally is nonpartisan, the conduct of the campaign became partisan. And that's what we're talking about here, is about the conduct of the election, not the label. And so certainly we recommend, if you're interested in running for nonpartisan political office, definitely reach out to us for guidance so we can make you aware of the things to keep an eye out for to ensure you don't unwittingly violate this law. And then in addition, I think this one's particularly important for the National Capital Region. There are certain localities, specific localities included in the law, where an employee can be permitted to run in local elections, even if it's partisan, and provided they run as an independent. This is a very complicated aspect of the Hatch Act. Certainly, we recommend that if you're going to be running for a local election that's partisan, but you'll be running as an independent, you must reach out to us for guidance, because it really only applies to very specific localities where a large number of the residents in that area happen to be federal employees. And so what they've done is accepted those localities from this restriction and said that, you know, certain employees can run in those elections, but they must run as an independent, and there's a lot of pitfalls to keep an eye on. So certainly, if you're interested in running for any office, whether partisan or not, we recommend you reach out to us to get some basic guidance. So what exactly is a partisan election? So really, it's going to be any election where a candidate is running as a representative or is kind of affiliated with any political party. So once those partisan politics get entered into the equation, that's when you want to reach out to us for guidance. And so I actually duplicated this slide. So, but that's what a partisan election is. Again, anything connected to a political party, when that gets introduced into an election and the conduct starts to shift in that direction, it could be partisan. And the fourth component, the fourth of the 24/7 Big Four restrictions, that you cannot knowingly solicit or discourage political activity of anyone with business pending before your employing office. So what is business pending before the employing office? It could be any person who's involved in an audit, an investigation, applications for grants, contracts, licenses, permits, rulings, agreements, etc. Really, anyone who has some official business with the Park Service, with the employing office, you can't solicit or discourage their political activities in any way, shape, or form. So what it is, it's to prevent employees coercing the people who are doing business with us to take a particular position in a political election or particular stance for a political party or against a political party. So just avoid talking partisan politics with people who are approaching you for official action of any kind. This includes, our partners and things like that. Before moving on, I do see one question that popped through. So it says, I'm an election officer in my town. They asked us to identify to a party for actions which require a Dem rep to authenticate, count, et cetera. Is this partisan in your view? Take AL to the submit. So we'll have to talk about that one a little more. So the restriction has to do with running for public office. So you can't participate or you can't be a candidate for election. The 24/7 restrictions don't prohibit you from engaging in certain political activities in your own time. So I'll talk with you, Kathleen, a little bit more about that. Okay, so again, just to recap, there's those big four: no official authority to influence the outcome of an election, no soliciting or accepting political contributions, can't be a candidate in those partisan elections, and don't solicit or discourage the political activities of persons doing business with your office. And so again, those are those 24 hours, 7 days a week restrictions. In addition to those restrictions, there are some restrictions that only apply when we are in the federal workplace or on duty. They're a little bit more broad in their coverage. They restrict more of the things that we can't do, but they don't apply all the time. They only apply in these certain circumstances. So what it says is that employees may not engage in political activities while they are on duty. And this includes while teleworking or if you're on official travel or even official time for union duties. Includes when you're in a government room or building, whether on duty or off, including break rooms, conference rooms, union offices. So it does not include employee residential housing, but where official government business is conducted in a room or a building, we cannot engage in political activity. Can't engage in political activity while you're wearing an official uniform or insignia, for instance, the arrowhead or secondary mark, anything that ties you kind of visually back to the Park Service or your federal employment. And we can't engage in any political activity while we're using a government vehicle. What exactly constitutes a partisan political activity? It's a good question. Political activity is any activity that's going to be directed toward the success or failure of either a political party, a candidate for partisan political office, or a partisan political group, right? So that key component there is political parties, partisan office, and partisan groups. What is not considered a partisan political activity? Things like legislation, ideas, ballot initiatives, budget, issues, nonpartisan groups, those groups that are not directly tied or in support of a particular political party. These are not considered political activities. So the key is that the activities must not tie back to a political party, candidate, or partisan political group. So for example, right, would any of these stickers kind of constitute a political activity, a partisan political activity? Of course, yes. All of these are current candidates for a partisan political office, right? And so any activity or display of any material that connects back to any one of these individual political candidates would be covered by this Hatch Act prohibition. Similarly, anything that ties back to one of these partisan political parties. And it doesn't need to be one of the big two or the big three or four. It can be really any partisan political party that has, is covered by this. And so you can't, again, engage in any activities connected to those organizations or engage or display any materials connected to those organizations while on official duty or in a federal building or room or using your uniform. What about these? So we got two mugs here, one pro-life, pro-America mug, and then one I love Planned Parenthood. Would these be permitted or prohibited? These would be permitted because they are not connected directly to a partisan political candidate, a political party, or a partisan political group. They are issues, they are ideas. And so though, in many people's minds, there's, a certain kind of perspective that you associate these issues with, they are not directly tied to a partisan candidate, office, party, or group. So they're just ideas, and so those would be permitted. Again, we have issues, Dreamers of Dreams, keep families together, defend DACA. That's an issue, again, though it is not directly tied to a partisan political office or party or candidate. And so these are things, they're ideas, they are not covered by the Hatch Act. Let's get into a little bit of the specifics of some of the prohibited political activities that we can't do while on duty or in the workplace. So obviously we cannot distribute campaign materials, right? Any materials that are directly tied to a partisan political candidate or one of those political parties or groups, we can't distribute or display those while in the federal workplace. Can't perform campaign-related chores while you're on duty or in the federal workplace. You can be affiliated with a campaign in your personal capacity if you're not one of those federal restricted employees, but you can't do those types of chores while you're on duty. You cannot wear or display any partisan political buttons, shirts, signs, or other items while you're on duty or in the workplace. You can't make political contributions to any party, candidate for partisan office, or political group. So again, even if you're on break, if you hop on your email, even on your personal phone or personal computer, and you get an email asking to contribute to a partisan political campaign, you can't do that while you're in the federal workplace, even if you're off duty. If you're in that federal workplace, you can't do that. You may not post or comment to a blog or social media site advocating for or against any partisan political party, candidate, or partisan group, again, in the federal workplace while on duty. You may not use any email accounts, social media, to send forward any content that advocates for or against a partisan political party, candidate, or political group. And you cannot make personal donations while on duty in the federal workplace. So those are kind of some of the core examples of what you can't do while you're in the federal workplace or on duty. Keep in mind that we all walk around with portable computers. Just be very careful engaging in any kind of political activity in the federal workplace, and ensure that you keep these things in mind. So one quick tip, I think this question comes up fairly regularly around the election times. Can you display a photograph of a candidate in your office? Generally, once that individual becomes a candidate for partisan political office, any display of them or anything tying them back to their campaign is covered by the Hatch Act and can't be done. However, there is an exception if all of the following criteria apply, right? The photograph has to be on display prior to that candidate actually entering into the election or in advance of the election season. The employee must be in the photograph with the candidate, right? So it can't just be a picture of your favorite candidate sitting on your desk, but if it's a personal photograph of you and someone who happens to be running for a political office, and it was in your office prior to the election, that can stay. However, remember, you cannot have any political purpose for displaying that photograph. So for example, let's say that maybe one of your local congressmen from way back when, you received an award, and after the award ceremony, you took a photograph with that candidate, or I'm sorry, with that representative. And then let's say 10 years down the line, that representative happens to run for re-election or another partisan campaign of some kind, and you've had that photograph in your office this whole time. It has both you and the now candidate in the photograph. That can stay. What you can't do, though, is around the election time, put up a photograph of just the candidate running for election, because that would be covered by the Hatch Act. So we covered kind of the basics of the off-duty 24/7 restrictions and the on-duty in the workplace restrictions. So what are some of the repercussions if an employee is deemed to have violated the Hatch Act? So the Merit Systems Protection Board may order in response to a violation of the Hatch Act removal, reduction in grade, a debarment from federal employment for a period of up to 5 years, suspension, reprimand, or civil penalty up to $1,000. So I just simply point this out so that you're aware there are penalties for these things, and to kind of illustrate why it is important and in your interest to keep these things in mind and understand that there are some repercussions for violating any aspect of the Hatch Act. But I do want you to be at ease. The Hatch Act is, to a certain extent, a little bit intrusive, but for most of us, most of all of us who are those less restricted employees, when we're off duty, out of the federal workplace and not in uniform or in a federal vehicle, not using government resources, we all can still be American citizens. We can be candidates in those nonpartisan elections. Again, just reach out to us for guidance. We can register and vote as we may choose. We can assist in voter registration drives. We can participate in nonpartisan campaigns. We can contribute money to political campaigns, parties, and partisan groups. We can attend political rallies that we choose and meetings. Again, make sure you're not wearing your uniform or the insignia. You can join political clubs and parties. You can campaign for or against referendum questions, constitutional amendments, or municipal ordinances. And then again, if you're not further restricted, you can even circulate nominating petitions, campaign for or against partisan candidates, make campaign speeches for partisan candidates. You can distribute campaign literature in nonpartisan elections. In partisan elections. Again, just make sure it's not a direct solicitation for money. You can volunteer to work on a partisan campaign. You can even be an officer in a partisan political party in your own time. And you, of course, can express opinions about candidates and issues. Just remember that if you're on duty and in the federal workplace, if it's political activities connected to a political party or a particular partisan candidate, to avoid doing those things while on duty or in the federal workplace. So to recap kind of the core components of the Hatch Act, we have those 4 24/7 restrictions that bar our official position or authority, bar using our official position or authority to influence the outcome of an election. It bars our fundraising in connection to partisan political activities. It bars us from running for office in a partisan political election, and it bars us from influencing politically those who do business with our office. And then, of course, no political activity while you're on duty in the federal workplace, wearing a uniform, or in a government vehicle. So those are the 5 core restrictions of the Hatch Act. So I'd like to get a little bit more in-depth now with social media, emails, and the internet and technology. As you saw at the very beginning, this law came out way back in the 1930s. And so the developments since then in the realm of technology and social media and things like that probably were not accounted for when this law was first out. And so I think it's important to kind of update you all on kind of some of the things to watch out for here in the 21st century as it relates to the Hatch Act. With respect to email, remember that when you're on duty in that federal building, you cannot forward a partisan political email to others, even if it's from your own personal device, right? Even if it's from your own personal cell phone, your own personal computer, if you're on your lunch break, you're in the break room, it doesn't matter. While you're on federal property or in a federal building, you cannot forward those partisan political emails. So partisan political email is anything that's directed toward the success or failure of a party, candidate, or political group, right? So receiving an unsolicited email would not violate the Hatch Act. If you're browsing your email on your lunch break and you notice that there's a partisan email that came through, nothing's wrong with you receiving that, right? What you can't do is forward it to other individuals, whether or not they're your coworkers, while you're on duty or in the federal workplace. So the bottom line is, if you see anything that's connected to partisan politics in your email, save it for when you're back home, out of the federal workplace. So this rule does apply to all forms of messaging, including social media, Instagram, Twitter, and things like that. Emailing subordinates. So if you are a supervisor, you should never send partisan political emails to those you supervise, even if you're home and off duty and you send it to their personal email address, even if it doesn't include fundraising. Just the idea is that we shouldn't be coercive in any way to our subordinates as it relates to political activities, right? Again, as mentioned before, the Office of Special Counsel does consider the subordinate-supervisor relationship to be inherently coercive, and we should avoid any kind of implication that we're coercing our subordinates to lean one way politically or another. So social media on duty and or in the workplace. So again, similar to emails, remember that we're prohibited from engaging or participating in any political activity while we're on duty or in that federal workplace. So on your lunch break, in the halls, in break, if you're at your duty station, you may not use social media to engage in any kind of partisan political activities or comments. And so again, anything that's connected to a partisan political party, political candidate, or political group cannot do while you're on duty in the federal workplace. Outside of work, just be careful, right? So filling in your official NPS title or affiliation in the profile section of either Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or anything like that, without anything else kind of directly connected to that affiliation, would not be a violation of the Hatch Act. Even if you share your personal political views from time to time on your social media, just be aware of how your comments might be perceived and be aware how someone observing that might make the connection between your official position and what you're saying. What you can never do, again, whether on duty or off, is use your official title or affiliation in any partisan political comment you do post on social media, right? That's going to be one of those 24/7 restrictions where you can't use your NPS affiliation or your authority in connection with any partisan political activities, okay? So just be very careful and be cognizant of those rules when engaging in social media, and just be careful not to connect your official position in any direct way to your partisan political comments. So what about blogging and things like that? So again, the Hatch Act does not prohibit you from expressing your personal opinions. This, of course, includes blogging about your partisan political beliefs when you're off duty and out of the federal workplace, not using those federal resources or authority. But remember, you're prohibited from violating any of those big four Hatch Act restrictions that we talked about at the beginning. So, for example, if you put out your political beliefs in a big blog, you can't then also link to a donation page for a partisan political web page or candidate or anything like that. So you can talk about partisan politics and you can do all that. But what you can't do is fundraise or solicit or accept donations for partisan political activities. So let's talk briefly a little bit about how the Hatch Act applies to NPS parklands. So where an event occurs on NPS lands and it meets the definition of political activities, there may be certain restrictions, well, there are certain restrictions that apply to participation by employees while on duty or off. However, NPS officials can still grant permits for political activities to be conducted outdoors on parklands if it's otherwise consistent with our NPS regulations for permitting similar activities, right? So in other words, we should continue to refer to those general regulations governing demonstrations and special events and determine whether or not to approve or deny the permit based on that procedure. If the event is to be indoors, however, because remember within the Hatch Act, it prohibits political activities within a federal building or room, definitely reach out to the Ethics Office, Solicitor's Office immediately for guidance about how the Hatch Act might implicate in a situation like that. Some things for NPS employees to keep in mind in relation or in connection to political activities that are occurring on outdoor NPS parklands. The employees themselves still remain subject to all those Hatch Act restrictions. So even if the event is permitted through the proper channels, NPS employees must not participate or appear at political campaigns, activities on duty or in uniform, right? Unless their job requires them to provide logistical support or other services that would be provided for any similar event, right? So if you're a law enforcement officer and part of your official duties is to provide, security and support to any large gathering within the park, of course, you have to be there as part of your duties. Similarly, if you're a maintenance mechanic or kind of property manager and your duties inherently require you for logistical purposes to be on hand there at the event, those are permissible reasons for you to be at political events. But outside of that, employees should avoid appearing to participate in partisan political events that are occurring on parklands. And so again, even those employees that are permitted to be there to provide that logistical support should refrain from being photographed in conjunction with the event, if at all possible. So here I've included a number of additional resources, for more information on the Hatch Act. There are a lot of kind of specific scenarios that employees encounter on a day-to-day basis. So I've included Hatch Act frequently asked questions link. But the key one, ethics office at nps.gov. We're available to answer any specific questions you may have about your activities, about something that you're interested in doing. We're happy to help you, and so certainly encourage you to reach out. So that covers the core content that I had prepared for the Hatch Act. I would like to open it up for any questions, specific questions or scenarios that any of you might have. I see that a few have already come through, and I'll attempt to address those in line, but I will open it up for questions now.
So the first question was about the hedgehog and the
yeah, let me go back. Let's see here.
View, and then I'll follow ones up with that. So there was a mule, an elephant, and in the middle was a porcupine.
Yeah, so that was just, I didn't know this until I was putting this together, but that's the, I guess, the official libertarian animal. And so again, that connects to the Libertarian Party would be one of those partisan political parties, and so kind of any direct connection to them would be considered political activity if it takes place on duty. And then, that applies to not only those three that I had up on the slides, but, the Green Party, any kind of registered political party, that participates in partisan political elections would be covered by those restrictions that happen within the federal workplace or on duty.
Well, so the next question was about bumper stickers on your vehicle in a federal parking lot. Yeah,
so you can have bumper stickers on your personal vehicle. Kind of the idea is that don't make your vehicle look like a campaign mobile, right? So it's okay to have a bumper sticker or two on your vehicle, but if it goes over the top and is clearly kind of intended to draw a significant amount of attention, that's something that would be restricted in the federal parking lots.
Great. So what about past campaigns that have existed, or campaign buttons or campaign materials? So old posters or buttons or collections or things like that.
Great question. Yeah. So what will be restricted kind of indefinitely are going to be anything that ties to an active political party, right? So if a former old campaign button is clearly kind of connected to either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, Libertarian Party, so on and so forth, that's going to be restricted indefinitely. As far as former candidates for office, it can be permissible, right? So the restriction is going to only restrict current candidates for partisan political office, right? So if you put up like a picture of your, I don't know, favorite president from years ago or a political button from years ago, and that person is either retired or no longer engaging in seeking election for a partisan office, that's not going to be covered by the Hatch Act, right? So I think in the context of like a historical button or kind of a really old one, not going to be a problem unless it's directly tied to one of those partisan political groups or parties. In the context of an active politician, you got to be very careful because politicians go in and out of seeking, election. They go in and out of being a candidate. And so while the Hatch Act isn't going to cover them after the election has taken place, at some point in the near future, they might again become a candidate. This happens, every 4 years in the case of presidents, 6 in the case of senators, and 2 in the case of representatives federally. Of course, statewide and things like that might be different. But so just keep in mind that the Hatch Act is covering candidates for partisan political office. And so while it can be possible to display buttons and things like that of past candidates, historical candidates, and things like that, just be cognizant of kind of the current events of what's going on, because once they do become a candidate, that's when those things become restricted.
Great. So the next question was about the Big Four restrictions, and the comment was you can't even use your personal email on your personal computer on your personal time to fundraise for a candidate or a party on your off-duty.
Yeah, so that's correct. So those restrictions, again, are 24/7. They apply to all of us at all times. And again, it doesn't restrict us from engaging in kind of political activities. What it's saying is that we can't actually ask for money, essentially. So we can't solicit, receive, or accept money. We can donate if we want to. We can provide kind of material support to events. We can stuff envelopes and things like that, but what we can't do is actually make the direct request to anyone.
Ever.
Ever. While you remain a federal employee, yeah. And again, in connection, you know, with those partisan political activities.
Great. So if you're in a park and there's a lot of locations that people like to take photos of, you're in your official capacity and a political candidate comes by, shakes your hand, and a picture is taken. So it's in the, so the example is the president visits the park where you work and takes a photo with the staff. Can you display that?
So if can you display the photograph with, you know, so it really depends if that person is a candidate at the time, right? So remember, there's that exception. So personal photographs, in other words, kind of not official portraits or anything like that, where the employee is in the photograph and it was on display prior to the election taking place, it can be displayed. I think in this context, if we're talking about an ongoing current candidate who comes and takes a photograph, can the employee display it in the lead up to the election? I would suggest probably not. So you want to be very careful, because that can imply kind of that, you know, connection to political activity. You know, if you were to display that photograph and that person is an active candidate for a partisan office.
Great. And just to review the questions about, you have the Big Four prohibitions, but then you have the activities that you can do when you're off duty. The question is, what if you live in park housing? So you're in park housing in your park, in your house, and you, what are the restrictions on those? For instance, can you put a sign up outside your house in federal property, or can you have material inside your house and do those things while you're in your house?
Yes. So the restrictions for the on-duty kind of political activities things, we're talking about in a federal room or building, and generally that covers places. So Office of Special Counsel determined that covers places where official business is conducted, right? So employee housing, since it's primarily a residential dwelling, is not going to be captured by the Hatch Act unless significant official business goes on there. So yes, employees who are living on park property in residential areas, they can display and engage in political activities as long as they're not violating those 24/7 restrictions.
So you've got a contractor that's working for you on federal property, and they're engaging in some of these things. Does this apply to them as because they're working for the organization or on behalf of the organization, or are they exempt?
That's a good question. So the law itself, the Hatch Act restrictions itself, only apply to the federal employees. I think that certainly that raises some concerns and some issues, you know, to the extent of how the employees can engage with that particular contractor. But the actual law itself doesn't govern the conduct, this law at least, doesn't govern the conduct of those contractors.
Okay, so we got a question about an idea. So you said that ideas and issues are not prohibited, but candidates are. But the question is, what if a particular idea is really associated with a candidate or a party? So, for instance, the Green New Deal is an idea about social and political contract in America. It's associated with a particular party. Is that idea too partisan because it's tied, or is the general idea about what the Green New Deal says, infrastructure, social norms, et cetera, acceptable?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general matter, that would be acceptable. I mean, I think the caveat would be if whatever is being displayed or whatever is being talked about is directly and concretely tied to a partisan political party or candidate, that's going to be covered. But the idea of the Green New Deal, even though kind of similar to the examples kind of provided about DACA or things like that, even though the idea itself is commonly associated with a political party, it is not in itself directly tied to a partisan political party or candidate. And so that it is an idea, it's potential legislation. So yeah, it can be permissible to talk about, to display kind of a for or against that idea. Again, just be careful not to have that direct tie to the partisan candidate, party, or political group. So if you're going to display a sign or a bumper sticker in support of the Green New Deal, make sure that on the bottom it doesn't have sponsored by, Americans for the Democratic Party, for example, if that's even a group. But anything that ties it to one of those parties, candidates, or political groups would be covered.
Great. So you're a federal employee, your spouse and your children are not. Are there restrictions on them in terms of being dependents or associated with you?
No, so they would not be covered by those restrictions of the Hatch Act. If your spouse is really involved in political activities and kind of hosting fundraisers and things like that, I would just reach out for guidance and be careful to not directly associate yourself with those activities. But they are not, like some of the ethics rules, they are not kind of implicated in this law.
So there's a question about sitting on a partisan political committee as long as the activities are done on your private time.
Yeah, that's right. So if you're a less restricted employee, so by and large, 99% of the Park Service employees, you can engage in those political activities. You can join groups, you can sit on committees, you can be members on your own time, not using your official resources and things like that. That doesn't fall into the category of any of those 24/7 restrictions. Just remember, you can't do it on duty in the federal workplace or anything like that. So you can't answer a phone call in connection to it while you're in the federal workplace or on duty. But yes, as a general matter, you can engage in those activities on your own time.
Great. And then somebody wanted the links, and I posted all the links in the chat. All those links should be live. So that's all the questions in the chat. If you have another question, put your name in the chat, and we can undo it, or we can read the question.
Hey, this is Erin. We have a question about how do Park Service volunteers fall under the Hatch Act? Are they required to follow that, or how does that work?
That's a good question. So my understanding is that the law only directly applies to, quote unquote federal employees. I'll have to go and check to see if that does or does not directly cover volunteers. I know as a general matter, we try and have our volunteers and interns and direct, contractors kind of live up to the standards and regulations that we're all subject to. Whether or not they're actually legally covered by the Hatch Act, I don't know off the top of my head, and I'll have to get back to you about that. I think certainly one area where I do know would be restrictive in that context is any kind of coercion on the part of the Park Service employees back to those volunteers, right? So inviting a volunteer who's working at the park for the summer, or an intern or something like that, to a political activity, or encouraging them to support a particular partisan group. that would certainly be covered by the Hatch Act. I just don't know if the personal individual activities of those volunteers would be covered in a similar way.
Matt, we have another question about photos. What if you have a staff photo with a candidate's spouse displayed in your office?
Well, so I mean, is there any implication that that photo is in support of the candidate? I mean, the spouse isn't directly running for office, so that doesn't kind of have that inherent connection. I mean, I think as long as there's no direct tie to the candidate, I think that would be okay. You know, without any, you know, symbols or kind of, as long as there's not like a sign in the background or anything like that, I don't see why that would be covered.
Matt, we have another question regarding seasonal housing. Are there any Hatch Act considerations if the internet and housing is provided by the park? Interesting.
So the housing is kind of covered by that. It's personal residence. So again, that's not going to be covered by those on-duty restrictions. Of course, the activities will be covered by this 24/7 one. As far as the internet is concerned, I haven't seen that one come up. My inclination is that it's going to be similar in the sense that that's going to be kind of included in that being your residence as opposed to an official resource. But I do want to kind of check into that and make sure I'm not missing something. And so I'd have to get back to you about whether or not you can use government-provided internet for the political activities. My sense is that you probably can, but I do want to confirm.
So if I write a letter to an elected official about an issue, can I mention that I work for the National Park Service?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is probably not going to be, so within the ethics regulations, when writing in our personal capacities, you're allowed to mention your government position or affiliation as one of a number of biographical details. So in other words, if you're explaining your background and perspective to an elected representative or to anyone for that matter, it can be mentioned as one of those details. It just can't imply that you're writing on behalf of or in connection to the Park Service. In the context of the Hatch Act, I think it's a matter of degree to the extent to which it could be interpreted as actually using your authority. But again, if it's just in connection to an issue, though, and not directly in support of a candidate or party or political group, then it's not even going to be covered by that Hatch Act. But what we can't do is write a similar letter to a newspaper or something like that directly in support of one of those candidates and be referencing our affiliation. But I think writing to a representative or something and mentioning your position as one of the facts about your background, that's generally going to be okay.
Matt, another question we have is, can a federal building display a photograph of a sitting POTUS once they declare candidacy?
So the official portraits, I think so that's accepted. The official portrait of the president and vice president in a federal building is official and routine. So that's not going to be covered by the Hatch Act. But anything beyond that official portrait, an informal photograph or things like that, once that politician, official becomes a candidate again for partisan political office, they are going to be covered. And so really the only thing that's going to be permitted is going to be that official portrait.
You had mentioned issues, legislation, and budget as topics that are not restricted. Could you expand on that more, or are they restricted?
So they're not restricted by the Hatch Act. So talking about those things or displaying or advocating for or against them, ideas, legislation or kind of budget proposals and things like that are generally going to be okay under the Hatch Act. There are some additional restrictions having to do with lobbying, using official resources for lobbying and things like that, but that's kind of beyond the scope of Hatch. But again, generally, as far as talking about or writing about or kind of displaying materials connected to those ideas, like a budget proposal or something like that, is generally not going to be covered by the Hatch Act. It has to have that nexus directly to a partisan political party, candidate, or group. Does that clarify it at all?
It does. So there is still some lobbying restrictions and some other things you would want to look out for.
Yeah. By and large, with respect to lobbying, it's the idea is that we can't use official resources, and this is actually kind of like it's more of a restriction on the agencies of the federal government using time and resources of employees to engage in lobbying Congress for legislation, things like that.
Great. Is there a limit on the kind of platform in which an issue may be mentioned? For example, is there a difference between having a mug with an issue on your desk versus taking sides on an issue in an interpretive talk or a larger audience?
So, the limit on the kind of platform. So no, not on the Hatch Act. I mean, so I think the limit is going to be on the nature of what it is. So is it connected to one of those partisan political groups, candidates, or parties, not the extent to which it's kind of being out there, made public, whatever that position may be. So in the context of, of a mug, if it's an issue that you're particularly passionate about that's not connected to a partisan political candidate or party or group, that's going to be fine. Just as kind of giving a in-depth talk about a particular issue that you're passionate about wouldn't be covered. Again, the activities that we're talking about are going to be those ones that are tied to partisan political parties, candidates, and issues. In the context of an official presentation, you got to remember that in that official capacity, you're talking on behalf of the agency, and I mean, as long as you're authorized to speak about a particular issue, then that's generally acceptable. Again, just avoid that partisan political discussion.
And this isn't the only time we'll be able to ask these questions. We can contact the Office of Ethics at any point, correct?
Any point, yeah. Anything having to do with the Hatch Act or the Standards of Ethical Conduct, the conflict of interest laws, anything that you have, and even if you're not sure if it's ethics related or not, reach out. We are happy to help. We try to be as responsive as we possibly can. And that's honestly, as much as these trainings are valuable to talk about kind of the general overviews and things like that, there's no substitution for in-depth guidance based on your particular circumstance or question. So absolutely we encourage you to reach out to us anytime, ethicsoffice@nps.gov.